Welcome to this webinar organized by the RESISTIRÉ project. So the topic of the webinar is Research Agenda on Gender-Based Violence in Times of Crisis. And we will have the pleasure to hear from three panelists who I will introduce to you now. So Thomas Jacobsson. Thomas Jacobsson is a senior advisor working with Nordic Research Funding at NordForsk under the Nordic Council of Ministers. Previously, he worked as a senior research officer at Forte, the Swedish Research Council for Health, Working Life and Welfare, one of the main Swedish research funding organizations, where he led the project on the Swedish Government Commission on research and research needs in the areas of domestic violence, stalking, and honor-related violence. Lorena Sosa. Hello, Lorena, is a senior lecturer at the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights, affiliated with the Utrecht Center of European Research into Family and Law, and board member of the Utrecht Center for Global Challenges at Utrecht University. So Gabriela de Oliveira is head of policy, research and campaigns at Glitch, a charity based in the UK working to end online abuse, with a focus on the experiences of Black women and other marginalized groups. Glitch works on the trust and safety councils of some of the world's biggest tech platforms, including TikTok and Twitter. Gabriela's advocacy work also engages with legislation across the UK and EU. So thank you for joining us today. And now I will give the floor to my colleague, Alain Denis, who will tell you more about the RESISTIRÉ project.
Thank you, and I will share my screen, which I hope you can now see. So welcome from my side as well, and I will very briefly introduce the RESISTIRÉ project to you. RESISTIRÉ is a research project funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 program. We are 10 partners in the project. It's a relatively short project, started in 2021, and that will close in September next year, so 30 months duration. And you see the partners listed here, so 10 partners from 9 different countries. The originality of the project is that, although it is a research project, the ambition is to produce results during the course of the project and not only after it. Something is going wrong with my presentation. I'm sorry for that. It's maybe because I was admitting people in, and maybe Claire, you can take over now that I'm speaking. Thank you.
Yes, will do.
In the project, we use different research methods, and we use them and apply them in a very fast way. So the project is built on cycles in which we do research and then we analyze the results, we produce outputs, which I will explain. And you see this cycle on the right side of the slide with first insights, with collection of narratives, mapping of policies, but also looking at quantitative indicators, bringing all this together in co-creative workshops, which we call open studios, which are very long workshops. And when we produce solutions, and that's why we are here. RESISTIRÉ, as said, is funded by the European Commission on a special funding line for the impacts of the pandemic, and specifically on the socioeconomic impacts. And in RESISTIRÉ, we concentrate on the inequalities, and we work with the impact of the pandemic and the policies launched because of the pandemic, public health policies, on increasing or creating new inequalities. You see here the different activities that we do, but the key point of the project and the reason why we are here is that we produce 3 types of outputs on the basis of the research. One are recommendations. So we produce fact sheets for different stakeholders, starting with the policymakers. so that they would take into account the impacts on inequalities in their decisions. Second, we launch social innovations, and Ayşegül will explain this a little further in her presentation on the research agenda. And thirdly, we produce what we call research agendas. So during our research, we identify the knowledge gaps, and we then produce research agendas to inspire funders on what they could fund to bridge these research gaps. And today, we are sharing with you the research agenda on gender-based violence, which will be done by my colleague Ayşegül. So I will stop sharing my screen and am finished with this short presentation on the project.
Thank you very much, Alain, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure for us to be presenting to you the findings of the second cycle of our research, and to have a chance to listen to the comments and suggestions, reflections of our wonderful colleagues here. So let me share my presentation with you. I believe this is it. And it's now full screen, right? Great. So, as Alain said, RESISTIRÉ has been producing, based on the research findings, has been producing some material that we hope will be useful for policymakers, for activists, for NGOs, and for researchers at the same time. Since the beginning of the project, we've produced 14 fact sheets that were aimed at local, national, or European level policymakers, and several of these fact sheets, two of them very fundamentally, but others also incorporated the concept of gender-based violence. So two of the fact sheets were directly focused on gender-based violence, one at the EU level, also focusing on the Istanbul Convention, and another one addressing national level policymakers. For us, one of the better stories, if you will, or the good surprises of this process has been that only in a matter of months our fact sheets were indeed read by policymakers and for researchers, by researchers, and was quoted by Horizon Europe when the new proposal on March 8th was announced by the EU Commission, the new proposal for a directive on gender-based violence, also addressing the findings of our research and the recommendations that we were making, particularly to incorporate the gender-based violence experienced by LGBTQI+ people, and to incorporate digital violence. So we're very much hoping that in this third cycle too, also with the insights that we'll be getting from you, we will be able to pass on some of these learnings to both bureaucrats and policymakers at all levels. And as Alain mentioned, one of the creative parts of RESISTIRÉ has been to participate in a number of co-creative processes, open studios being quite central to them, 2-day intensive workshops where we focus on specific topics. Out of these processes in the first and second cycle, 8 different areas, and within them, I think 9 different projects have been funded. So there's gender-based violence through sports, a new set of pilot projects started in Serbia and Greece, and another one, Chen, based in the UK, providing support, providing a community of practice and networking possibilities for people responding to gender-based violence, for their self-care and learning and networking and collective care, so to speak. So what we produced from the first cycle was in our research agenda, there was a section focusing on gender-based violence, and some of the basic learnings of gender-based violence in the context of the pandemic were shared in this first research agenda, and you see some of the headlines there. and you can access that from the RESISTIRÉ website. So what we'll be discussing today is the second agenda that has come out of the second cycle of our research, which again has a section on gender-based violence, focusing on these 5 themes, which I will elaborate on. And you see the names of the main authors to this section of the research agenda, but of course, everyone in the consortium has contributed one way or the other. So this research agenda and the proposals that we make for future research have come out of different kinds of research, different aspects of different methodologies at the same time. We've interviewed at least 10 experts working on gender-based violence. There have been 2 workshops in the 2 cycles dedicated to gender-based violence, and 2 open studios, 2-day-long intensive workshops, again, that have been dedicated to different aspects of gender-based violence, also focusing on digital violence. There has also been an intensive mapping of the rapid assessment surveys done in the context of the pandemic, focusing again on the domain gender-based violence, and a mapping of NGOs and civil society initiatives that have been engaged in responding to gender-based violence. And lastly, in this second cycle, we looked into the national recovery plans responding to the pandemic challenges, and analyzed how they incorporated gender-based violence or gender inequalities in general. And unfortunately, the results were not very promising. So that's part of our finding. So to go into more specifically the 5 headings, one is the increase in gender-based violence and the lack of systematic data collection. So one significant finding of RESISTIRÉ and other researchers who have worked in this period is that women and LGBTQI have become particularly vulnerable to violence in the context of the pandemic, with lockdowns, online work and schooling, isolation from support networks, the economic and housing crisis, and so on. There has been a significant increase in online digital violence, and yet not much of this has reflected in the reporting of gender-based violence for different reasons, part of which has to do with the difficulty of safe and secure reporting in, again, context of lockdowns and being in the same space with potential or present perpetrators. So what can we do? The lack of systematic and standardized data collection and monitoring systems regarding gender-based violence at both the national level and the EU level has been an important finding of our research. 2 major knowledge gaps have come out. One is the consequences of gender-based violence, particularly from an intersectional gender plus perspective. And 2, the need for longitudinal studies with survivors of gender-based violence that can tell us the before, during, and after of a crisis such as the pandemic. So some of the research questions that have come out of this part of our analysis is, what happens when there's an overlap of several crises, as we have right now? Pandemic, energy, food, economic crisis, armed conflict, in terms of the implementation of policies, both in terms of the prevalence and the implementation of policies against gender-based violence, and how can we assure short and long-term support to victims and survivors? What is needed to make data collection on gender-based violence more systematic and more inclusive, particularly from a gender plus perspective? This comes out as a major question for us all to address. How can local, national, and EU level data be synchronized for effective response at all levels? Again, is another policy-related research question that has come up. And in what ways does data collection improve the design of evidence-based policies and programs? What can we learn from what is already existing in the field, and how can we show the significance of data collection for the development of policies and programs in this area? What impact have anti-gender discourses and movements that are on the rise throughout Europe and the world have had on systematic data collection on gender-based violence at the local, national, and EU level during the pandemic, and what are the consequences of this? To move on to a second heading, which has to do with the methodological challenges as well as possibilities. Of course, we are all faced with the challenges of collecting intersectional quantitative data, particularly in the context of the pandemic, due to the prohibitions and safety issues related to asking questions about categories of significance in terms of inequalities such as ethnic and religious affiliation or sexual orientation. So the need for more qualitative data collection in exploring intersectional consequences of the increase in gender-based violence has come up as an important finding, and the need for collaborative, interactive action research methodologies that involve all stakeholders, including NGOs in the field, and that recognize victims and survivors of gender-based violence as agents of change and co-creators of knowledge. This has been emphasized in all of the workshops that we've had. There are now important initiatives, especially coming from the NGOs themselves, that show us how this can be done. And I think this is going to be an important methodological challenge for the future of research on gender-based violence. It's great that we have Gabriela from Glitch, who can perhaps talk to us about some of their work in this field. So the main research questions that have come out of this heading, methodological challenges, are: what are some of the new methodological and ethical challenges that are introduced in a crisis context, such as the pandemic, for gender-based violence research? What strategies have been or can be developed to address these challenges? To what extent are these methodologies intersectional in terms of addressing experiences of, for instance, the LGBTQI+ and other gender plus intersections? In what ways do different methodologies of gender-based violence research contribute to understanding the various experiences and perceptions of gender-based violence and its intersectional impact? Quantitative, qualitative, longitudinal, which ones work better, or which combination of methodologies work better to explore intersectional impact? How can different stakeholders and survivors of gender-based violence be included in the research on gender-based violence as research partners and co-creators of knowledge? And how can we develop a bottom-up glossary of key terms which keep changing, which is the dynamism of the field, with the inclusion of different stakeholders and survivors of gender-based violence? The third heading has to do with the systematic and comparative analysis of better stories. We used Dina George's concept of the better story to emphasize the need for comparative and systematic analysis of better stories in different local contexts of responding to gender-based violence, not coming up with one recipe for all, but really questioning, asking what would be the better response in this particular context, and what are the existing better stories, and what would we gain as researchers by highlighting the changes that are possible in people's lives through our focus on better stories, serving as an inspiration perhaps, and preventing and responding to gender-based violence. So we see a lot of potential in highlighting in our research and making visible the better stories. So some key questions that have come out of that are: what are some of the key characteristics of better stories? What has contributed to making them better stories? How do existing structures and innovative solutions offered by these better stories of both policy and NGO responses impact individual lives of victims and survivors? What can we learn from both the personal and collective stories of resilience? And how can we make better stories more sustainable beyond the experience of the pandemic? The fourth heading has to do with specific country experiences and their comparative analysis. So one finding of RESISTIRÉ is that the absence of national and municipal crisis management plans that incorporate a gender plus perspective, and a response to gender-based violence. We have seen the fatal effects of this in the pandemic. So how can we move forward in this area, incorporating gender plus equality in crisis management plans? And I've highlighted the second one here. Women's and LGBTIQ plus shelters and support services have not been regarded as essential services in most countries during the pandemic. Again, our research is full of examples of the lethal, possibly lethal, very damaging consequences of this policy gap. Most of the national recovery and resilience plans omit gender-based violence altogether, and many of them omit gender altogether. Again, has come up as a major finding, and the need for further comparative research on public policy on gender-based violence. So the research questions under this heading that we would like to highlight are: how were different policies and actions regarding gender-based violence implemented in different EU countries, including responses to online and digital violence? More research is needed in this. Which recovery measures regarding gender equality and gender-based violence were implemented in the context of the resilience and recovery plans? With what consequences? There is no monitoring process involved in these plans, which is a major gap. What difference did the country's position in relation to the Istanbul Convention make in their response to gender-based violence? Was there a difference in different countries based on whether they had signed, ratified, and started implementing the Istanbul Convention? And in which countries were services regarding gender-based violence regarded as essential services? How did this change the effectiveness of responding to gender-based violence? Again, we feel that these questions are asking to be researched. And finally, we had very creative and very inspiring conversations about the need to do more research with perpetrators and also with changing masculinities. So there is a scarcity of research on perpetrators of gender-based violence, particularly in the context of the pandemic, which we have identified together with all the stakeholders we have been having these conversations and doing research with as a significant lack. There's also lack of quantitative and qualitative data on men's general perceptions of gender-based violence, as a lot of the research focuses on women and LGBTIQ+, and a lack of quantitative and qualitative data on alternative masculinities, on caring and non-violent masculinities. Again, in the context of better stories, we find this to be very important to make visible the changes and alternative possibilities. So some of the research questions that we'd like to highlight under this topic is: how do different men define and perceive gender-based violence? What are the consequences of gender-based violence for men as perpetrators, victims, and bystanders? What are the better stories of caring and nonviolent masculinities? What makes nonviolent masculinity possible? What happens when men choose to or are able to be caring and nonviolent? How are their lives and relationships transformed? And what's the impact of the increasing number of perpetrator programs that are being implemented in different countries, either publicly or through NGOs, on the struggle against gender-based violence? We feel that these questions also are asking to be researched. And thank you. This is an illustration from the feminist queer illustrator from Turkey, Aslı Alpar, highlighting the significance of solidarity and collective brainstorming, which we're here to do.
So thank you, Aisha, for this presentation. It's very interesting to have a summary of all of our work regarding gender-based violence. I think now would be a good time for some of our panelists to respond to this presentation and to this research agenda on gender-based violence. We unfortunately seem to have issues with Gabriela joining us today. So we will start with our other two panelists, and then we will see if she's able to join us later. So Thomas, would you be able to start now?
Sure, thank you so much for inviting me to this. important event and for letting me share my work and hear about what you've done. It's super interesting, and there's some overlap, but also some differences in what we've been doing. So hopefully that's going to be clear in my presentation. And as you said, I'm Thomas Jacobsson. I used to work at Forte, that's the Swedish Research Funder, and we had a special commission on this. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. And good morning from Sweden. It's about 10 degrees here, so I'm rather cold here in my flat, but I'm going to do my best without sneezing, sniffling. So there we go. I'll just start off with just giving a little bit of a background about what Forte is. So in Sweden, we have 4 public research funding councils, and Forte is under the Ministry of Social Affairs. So we have we fund research within health, working life, and welfare. We have a budget of about 750 million Swedish crowns, which is about 75 million euros, I guess, that goes to mostly open calls, but also about half of the money goes to open calls and half of them go to thematic calls. We have a wide range of funding mechanisms. Mostly goes, as I said, then to sort of open basic research, but we also have the needs-driven research, and a lot of it is we try to fund interdisciplinary research. We have, apart from the funding bit, some missions within communicating and spreading knowledge and encouraging research collaboration. And we also get these specific government commissions. Sometimes it's about funding, and sometimes it's about collecting research findings that's already out there in a hopefully a sort of a presentable manner for the public or for professionals to take part of the research that's already out there. Unfortunately, these commissions are usually extremely short in their time span, which affects how ambitious we can be in the work. And for this work, we had only from August to February so we had to be very, very quick, and also work with limiting the scope to be able to deliver 14th of February of this year. So it's been a year since I've worked with these issues, or almost a year. So if I'm a bit rusty, please forgive me. What were we asked to do then? So we were asked to actually survey reviews, so existing research reviews in this area. We weren't specifically asked to survey primary research articles, but existing reviews. And the focus was not on some of the issues you discussed in your presentation about consequences and prevalence and so on. It was more actually entirely a focus on efforts, methods, and ways of working to prevent or to treat this issue in an effective manner. So it's more of a sort of a positivistic take on it, and how could we help professionals active in this area to work effectively. And this should also be seen in the light of a change in the legislation in Sweden, where social services have, it's mandatory for them to work with perpetrators as well as helping victims. And the other focus was the research that we collected and presented should be near client and near practice. So have that close to practice focus. The political context is that in Sweden there's a national strategy that goes on to 2026, and the goal is sort of that the men's violence against women should cease. And there's what's important in this context is there's a focus on the prevention, as well as sort of the punishment bit and the treatment bit. So trying to move the focus from being sort of reactive to being proactive is a sentence that's in this strategy that I think summarizes it quite well. And it also puts focus on the participation of and responsibility of men in stopping the violence, which is again overlapping with the focus you had in your presentation. And some of the points of departure that we had in the work was obviously the Istanbul Convention, seeing gender-based violence and other forms of violence as a breach of human rights, and they also set focus on prevention. We used a social ecological explanatory model where sort of these kind of violent expressions are seen as a complex phenomenon and a result of different levels and interactions of different societal levels. And as I said, we had a focus on prevention and risk management. This is also because we wanted to contribute with something new, because in Sweden there were quite a few government reports summarizing and presenting effective treatment. I call it treatment models, but trying to not treatment, that's the wrong word. Supportive action for victims of abuse and violence. So yeah, this is the model. I'm sure you're all aware of it, but this is sort of prevention at different levels and using this social ecological model. So these are just some examples of different prevention or treatment work that can be done in this setting. And the methodology we use to do this to deliver on this commission, given the time frame, was that we worked with Professor Susanne Strand, that's at Örebro University. It's a part of your collaboration as well. And they did a lot of the analysis and the writing work in the report. And we worked with one of the Swedish agencies in this area that has a mandate to collect and analyze research and articles and reviews and so on. So they're super professional and did a great job in collecting what's out there for us. So, and then we did have this like sort of three overarching areas where it was violence in close relationship or sort of domestic violence. We had honor-based violence was also and was also a big part of it, and stalking was added by Susanne in collaboration with us, because it's an important aspect that needs to be highlighted, because it's sort of the violence can continue even after a breakup or so. There weren't a great deal of reviews out there, but the vast majority of them were in this field of violence in close relationships. I don't know if this is a Swedish, if this isn't how it's discussed in international literature, but in Sweden, the translation to English is violence in close relationships, where there were 35 reviews that were included. So this was where the majority of reviews were done. Only one review for stalking and one review for honor-based violence. And as you can see here, also some primary studies were included, because for stalking and honor-related violence, we did do a search for primary studies because there were so few reviews. Yeah, we had a reference group and a hearing. So some of the results then, I'd like to say that in this report, there's an executive summary that's 4 or 5 pages long in English. So you can take part of some of these results, because there were lots of results. And I'm just going to tell you some of the very overarching sort of things that were presented in the report. And this is one of the things I thought we'd be talking about today, was how to present your findings to funders. And I think that funders like to keep things on quite high abstraction levels, because the funders want to stay away from being too specific in their calls, because they want to leave things up to researchers as well to formulate what they want to do in proposals. So I think that the main sort of finding was that there is some evidence, not strong evidence, but there is some evidence, early evidence of that some primary prevention programs can be effective. But this, as I said, this is early days. That's the impression we got from the research field, and that the research gaps are very large in this area. This is combined with the difficulties of conducting research in this field. There is also some evidence, and this is connected to the first point, of course, that sort of efforts to change norms, attitudes, and knowledge in, for example, schools has a preventive effect. And treatment for perpetrators really has to be individually tailored to the perpetrator's situation to be effective. So one model sort of fits all. This doesn't work, and that was one of the clearest findings, and that's something we need to step away from, and we need to be tailoring, even though it's more expensive probably, and maybe more difficult as well. This is something that we need to move towards. And something, the fourth thing that I'd like to bring up to the table as well, because it's so important, is the coordination work by authorities, public authorities and NGOs and so on, seems to increase the quality of support that victims and their families get. But this is sort of not entirely clear what type of coordination work is the most effective, because there's such a wide range of how this work is done. And for sort of a proper summary to be done, more work needs to be done in terms of what's best practice and not. But there's some emerging evidence here that this is a good way to move forwards. And when it comes to the research gaps, there's a lot of points. So as you can see here, there's some of them in English here. I'd like to bring some things to the table as well. Honor-based violence. So the state of the art here is this. There's hardly any research at all that's applicable to a Swedish context, and this isn't very good news at all, because this is an area that is increasingly mandatory for Swedish social services and other services to work with, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence base for how to do that in an effective way. It's the same thing, both honor-based violence and violence in close relationships and stalking, and this incredibly difficult work. And if you don't do it there's plenty of scope to do things in the wrong way, and that can make things worse rather than improve them. So this is something that we feel that there needs to be a lot more research done to help out practice. There needs to be, and this corresponds to your findings as well, that there needs to be research that includes several different populations. So we found nothing on disabilities, on minority groups, on LGBTQI people, and how effective interventions can work for them and how they can be tailored for their various needs. The causality of effects of different methods and work that's been done to prevent, that's something that needs to be developed so that we're sure that what's being done actually has a clear effect. So that's a methodological issue in many senses in the research that's going on. And there needs to be an increased consensus on which outcome measures are being used in the research. There needs to also be more implementation research. So we develop models of how we think things are going to work in real life, but we need to put those methods into action and see how do they need to be modified and changed for various settings. So that's an important thing to also spend money on. So apart from this report and the recommendations and the research gaps that we identified there, we also had a special letter to the government, and this letter was about a recommendation for if there would be money to spend on a specific funding scheme, how would that be developed? So we did say that, look, there is a strong case here for making a strategic research funding program. We did a quick search in our databases to see how many projects were ongoing in Sweden with external funding in this field. And there were, I think this was a year ago, and there were 8 ongoing projects, and very few of them had to do with actually studying methods and prevention and work that's been done in practice. So this field seems very underdeveloped in Sweden. Sweden is a country of about 10 million people, and we do spend a lot of our GDP on research. So we could, I think, with some confidence say that this was underdeveloped. And the conclusion we draw from this report was also that in one of these strategic funding programs, sort of work and methods needs to be combined with both prevention and treatment. So that there seems to be a divide in the research field for, at least in Sweden, researchers and practitioners primarily focusing on treatment and methods to support victims. And then there's another group that are more supportive of prevention. And we see a need of these two factions, or we want to decrease polarization rather than decrease it. So, and we think there's a lot to learn between these two fields of research. We'd like to see the research, if we get extra funding, then that it will be cross-disciplinary and close to practice and policy, that it would not be basic research in that sense. It would be something that would be developed very closely and co-created with practice and policy as a support for the ongoing work that's being done. And it would need to be long-term, because we need to be able to follow the effects during much longer time than is usual. We can't just work with sort of 1 year follow-ups or a 1.5 follow-ups or 6 month follow-ups. We need to see the effects in longer term, especially for programs that are introduced in early years of people's lives. And then coming back to the point I made earlier about using research methodologies that are sort of powerful or strong enough to present the effects of these methods that are actually being used. And the final point is, since Sweden is a small country, we do tend to import international methods, and then usually sort of developed in the States or the UK or somewhere like that, and then they're sort of rolled out in the Swedish context without being sort of translated or adapted. So that would be a really important bit of this work, to work with adaptation and following through implementation research how these methods could be sort of tailor-made to a Swedish context. We did have a few lobbying and communication activities, presentations and discussions at the ministry and also at the parliamentary committee, but we're still waiting to see if Forte will get a commission with extra funding tailored for this specific area of research. Thank you so much, and I guess if there's questions, we'll take them at the end.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. It's great to hear from a specific national context. So I'm just mindful of time now, so I'll swiftly ask for Lorena to present her reaction to the research agenda regarding her own work on gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you to the team for this very interesting project, which I think is extremely valuable for all of us working on gender-based violence, and also for all the different levels, like Thomas was telling us about the research he carries out for the national government. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how I look at it from my own experience as an academic, as a researcher on gender-based violence. So perhaps I should start by highlighting that I'm a human rights scholar, so I focus on the law and the letter of the law and the implementation of the law and how this works out. And I want to provide my feedback from the specific experience of one of the research projects I worked in that was commissioned by the European Commission to provide basis for the current proposal directive on violence against women that you were also discussing. So together with my colleague from the University of Venice, Sara De Vito, we were asked to carry out this research for the European Commission through the Equality Law Network starting in December 2020, and we were supposed to finish also with a very tight span, like Thomas was saying. We were supposed to finish this mapping of criminalization of gender-based violence in the EU by May 2021. This was a very ambitious study that we carried out looking at the 27 EU member states plus the 3 EEA, so Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, and the UK, so 31 jurisdictions, and we mapped the domestic legislation on, let me count it for you because I have to think, looking at domestic violence, sexual violence and rape, stalking, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, female genital mutilation, forced marriages, forced sterilization and abortion, digital violence, and also the general part of the investigation and criminalization of gender-based violence are looking at the protection of victims, so the issuing of protection orders, their participation, compensation mechanisms, etc. So when we started looking at it, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of your report, which I think are extremely useful for research agendas in the future. And one is, of course, the availability of data and the systematic gathering, gathering of data on gender-based violence, the possibility to adopt an intersectionality perspective on the data collection to further the research. And then I want to highlight two particular areas that you mentioned that I think are extremely relevant for any future research agenda. And in relation to the availability of data, what we found starting this project, we wanted to have information on the increase of gender-based violence within the EU in the context of the pandemic and the adoption of different policy measures. And this was very difficult to come across. So we started looking for, as you can imagine, this was a project that demanded a lot from us to look at all this criminal and legislation on all these forms of violence across 31 states. So what we needed is data about the increase of gender-based violence that we knew was taking place. It was very difficult to come across. So what we found is that the CEPOL, which is the EU Agency for Law Enforcement Training and Needs, had issued a report on the impact of COVID-19 measures, and previously a report on the increase of domestic violence. But this was made based on respondents and not necessarily on the reporting, or there was no real comparison of, for example, reporting mechanisms of how could we look at this increase in the cases of violence, and they were only looking at domestic violence. So what CEPOL found, that this is information that we could bring into our report, is that the number of criminal cases had increased, but the report numbers had decreased. They also tried to find information how investigations and all the proceedings had been altered through the crisis. We also look at the European Institute of Gender Equality, and they had a report that was published on COVID-19 measures, also focusing exclusively on domestic violence. And they mentioned the spikes in reporting, but they don't provide any real data. Instead, they focus on the measures that were adopted. So already by the start of the report, we lacked this information, and the importance of lacking this information for us, because there was also a report by the FRA on victims of crime in 2021, but without taking into account the context of the pandemic. So for us, this was very important because we wanted to reflect to what level the legislation that we were reviewing was in practice working. To what extent could we adopt a critical take on the legislation that we were mapping without actually considering, for example, access issues or reporting issues or protection issues in this specific context of the pandemic. Why is this important? Because we look at gender-based violence from the perspective of intersectionality, and in that sense we assume or we understand the context of crisis as a context where different inequalities, existing inequalities, are exacerbated. So if we take this perspective that the context reveals or makes the different inequalities and their interaction visible, this was crucial for us to gather this information. In consequence, our report, which you can access, is the open access, and you can find it in connection to the proposal directive, even did not provide this information. So we had a much more narrow view of the real impact of the legislation, and therefore in that way is how we inform the European Commission. A second aspect, which I think your report very clearly highlights, is the necessity to gather data that allows for studies that adopt an intersectional perspective. And this is very clearly connected to this idea that in the context of crisis and the overlapping of crises like you were mentioning, these inequalities can be reconfigured. So you have a research question which I think is very suitable to capture this situation, which is how do outbreaks exacerbate and to what extent the different drivers change in the context of crisis. And I think this is a crucial question to keep on asking and ask in the future, because from my experience, what we see adopting an intersectional approach is that if we consider the crisis, in this case, the pandemic, but it could be conflict or it could be another issue, as the context where these inequalities play out, this is not only useful for the specific moment of the crisis, but it's something that will continue to reshape these inequalities in the future. Your identification of methodological challenges, I think it's also very useful for anybody working on gender-based violence, and it is indeed. So how do we incorporate these research questions in a way that is ethically responsible, that contributes to give voice to the victims of violence and also to different voices within these experiences as well. One of the questions that we had was, for example, to what extent the protection orders, which have been quite largely adopted at the EU level, at the domestic level within the EU, to be more specific, to what extent these protection orders take the particular vulnerabilities of people. For example, how do persons with disabilities access protection orders or participation within the proceedings? These were, of course, very relevant questions for our research. Finally, because I know that we are a bit in a hurry, Claire, I think you raised two questions which I think are, again, very relevant to continue looking into it for the future. And you asked to what extent or how has gender opposition discourses impacted on the systematic data collection. And I think based on my own research on gender oppositions, what I see is that the gender opposition discourses that we see in the public sphere have also reached institutional bodies and also monitoring bodies. And what we see in the monitoring bodies is that the very practical implications of these opposition movements result, for example, in budget cuts, in definancing of sector, restructuring of institutions and organizations. For example, bodies that were led by women's movements are now, women's NGOs are now redirected through other bodies within those states. And this, of course, has an impact on the type of data that we collect and how comparable the data becomes. So it has very concrete implications in practice for future research as well. So I think this is an extremely valuable question that you raised. And another one that I think is very interesting as well is the question about the connections between the perpetrator programs and the preventative approach that we want to incorporate in gender-based violence. So how to contribute to the construction of non-violent masculinities. And I think, again, here, the connection with more general preventative programs and awareness-raising programs and also educational curricula are very crucial. So we see, for example, that sexual education, the curricula on sexual education has also been affected by these, for example, gender opposition movements. And this is the connection between, okay, so how do we make this connection between the perpetrator program, so the ex post facto approach to the preventative approach in other areas is, again, very relevant in my view. So this is a very short reflection from my own experience as a researcher on gender-based violence to what is not there, what we lack. And again, I'm a lawyer, so to me, having the possibility to find this information and then think about my own body of norms with this in the background is crucial, and is research that we cannot do ourselves. It's research that we need interdisciplinarily from my colleagues. So thank you so much for this report, and I hope that we can have a discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lorena, and thank you, Thomas, for these two interesting interventions, which confirm the gap, definitely, and the nice words that you formulated, but that the gap is even bigger than what we identified or what we highlight as part of the results of RESISTIRÉ. Lorena, a question to you is maybe to have a look at the chat, because colleagues have been putting links to reports that you were suggesting, so that maybe you can confirm these are the right links and potentially add some links. And to all of you, please do not hesitate to ask questions through the chat. If not, the group is not too big, so we could potentially do it by raising the hand, but I think the most effective one is that you would put it in the chat, and the colleagues will help me if I'm speaking too much and I'm not looking enough at the chat to warn me if there is a question, because there are none as such at the moment. So I have maybe a first question to Thomas on the research you did, which is really interesting because it's really action oriented. So research that leads to having an impact on the actual services being provided. What was the place of digital-based violence in what you identified? So was that part of the reviews and the primary research that you identified, or was there a gap there as well? So was there any specific gap on the digital forms of violence?
That's a great question, and it would have been in terms of methods or work of how to prevent that or to manage instances and when that occurs to minimize risk. I need to go back and look in the search terms that we used, if that was included, to be able to answer your question though. So I can't do it straight away like this. I'm sorry.
Thank you, no problem. Maybe Lorena, the question to you as well, in terms of the digital forms or the use of digital techniques to perpetrate violence.
We looked into online violence, which we decided to call ICT related violence, to have it broader. So not only online, but also violence that is committed with ICT technology without necessarily being connected to the internet. What we found is that in terms of regulation, there is a huge trend to start regulating, and indeed the proposal, the directive covers online violence, which is, I think, a very important contribution. We found that there were extremely scarce definitions on what ICT violence is, or what online gender-based violence is. And when we found definitions of online violence, these were mostly gender-neutral type of definitions. The research behind the phenomena, the social phenomena, is also very scarce and non-comparable. So the possibilities to compare and identify, for example, okay, so these are the main behaviors that are being punished, was not there. what we did find also was a huge a difference in defining, for example, what is the most common form of gender-based violence, which is the non-consensual dissemination of private images. So also there we found a lot of distinctions to what is non-consensual. In some cases, the non-consensual part was in relation to the taking of the images and not necessarily the distribution, which is what we finally decided to include. So we found that there were huge gaps in terms of both how is the social phenomenon today when it comes to online violence, and also how the response is showing in terms of law and policy. And of course, the law runs behind the facts. So if we don't know what the facts are, that's already a difficulty.
Thank you. We have a question from Shoban. Shoban, maybe you can ask your question directly, or shall I read it from the chat?
I'm happy to ask. Hello, everyone from Dublin, Ireland. Thank you so much for such a stimulating session so far. And I'm really, I suppose one of the things we're seeing in Ireland is that the protective role of environments we haven't really considered before, potentially, and how we might activate them better in a return to some of those environments, such as the schools, studying, universities, but also workplaces as places that can be a place for providing information supports to victim survivors of different forms of gender-based violence, in particular intimate partner violence. And we're seeing some policy movement on this now for different sectors. So I think this is actually a wonderful research opportunity to see how we can maybe learn for different settings in terms of responding. And Thomas, you talked a lot about the prevention piece. So I just wanted to flag that, and I'm going to put one of the domestic violence policies we just have from one of our colleges in I'll put the link in now to the chat. So I just wondered if that was something as well, that places we wouldn't traditionally have thought about doing research and monitoring and see policy activation around, that now have become more apparent due to our experiences living and working through the pandemic. I hope that's clear enough. I've only had one coffee today, so maybe it's not so clear.
No, but I think it's an interesting route, so it's maybe less a question. So I don't know who to address the question to, but it's using the workplace as a place where you can get protection and be protected. So I don't know who wants to react, Thomas, I see.
We did have that as a theme as well in the report about workplace methods and sort of using the workplace as a space for seeing and acknowledging when someone is being victimized, and also for approaching mostly men then and having sort of programs to help them stop being violent. So, and there was we found some evidence there for effective methods actually again emerging. And what we did struggle a little bit with in this report, I remember coming back to sort of what point should we have when we sort of start the work, and what sort of lens should we be seeing this research through. Our go-to scope usually is public health, and that's, I guess, is one of the ways of framing this as well, and seeing lots of different arenas that are important where people move in and out of, and which of them are the most important in addressing and the violence.
Thank you. Aisha Gül, you have a question?
Yes, I might come in with a couple of questions. And I also see Gabriela has opened her video. I don't know if you're in a position to contribute, but we'd love to hear the work you're doing at Glitch. We've been very inspired by both the research and the policy recommendations you have made, and what suggestions you have for our research agenda. would you like to say a few words before I ask further questions?
Absolutely, thank you. And apologies, technical issues have been very difficult this morning, so I'm sorry for joining late, but it's been a really interesting discussion. And yeah, there are a few things really that come to mind. I really am supportive of this focus when we're thinking about online gender-based violence in particular, which is Glitch's focus of exactly what Tom's talking about. What does a public health approach to this issue look like? We can't look to just solve the problem on social media platforms. Of course, that's a big part of the work. We do a lot of work directly with tech platforms and companies. But for example, as the question came up, our research that was looking at the impact of online abuse at the beginning of the pandemic actually showed that in the workplace, that was something that that people were experiencing, and particularly Black women and non-binary people, those who have disabilities, and LGBTQ plus people were experiencing more of that abuse in the workplace. So not only thinking about the workplace as a place for prevention, but also as in prevention so that people can access support for what they're experiencing, but also as a place where abuse can occur, and how you kind of equip employers to understand their duty of care and understand their role in prevention and their role in supporting victim survivors is really important. And then the other kind of question around digital harms and where the gaps are, I think there is still a very long way to go in people understanding what online gender-based violence is as a continuum of harm from gender-based violence, which generally occurs offline. There are lots of forms, and Lorena mentioned, non-consensual image sharing is a really prominent form of online gender-based violence that we're seeing more and more. And at Glitch, we're going to be doing some research in the next year or so around how AI is used to create deepfake non-consensual images, as that seems to be a growing technological issue as those tools have been outsourced and made available to more people. But there are also lots of other forms of online abuse, and we see how in recent events with around leadership at Twitter, how quite quickly some of the policies and practices that can be in place to prevent things like sexual violence threats, rape threats, death threats, and doxing, which is when your personal information is shared online, which women experience at a much higher rate than men, and Black women in particular at a much higher rate than other women. How do we work as a sector across the online and offline spaces to understand how we raise this with legislators, we raise this with relevant parties? So again, thinking about public health approach, it's not just about talking to policymakers and tech companies, also advertisers in the online space have a really important role to play. So how do we speak to them about the role that they are facilitating and playing in that online gender-based violence when their adverts are appearing next to really toxic and harmful content? So there's a lot, I think there's a long way to go in terms of our understanding of the different forms of digital harm. And again, as Lorena mentioned, a lot of Glitch's work is trying to make the case for gendered approaches to digital harm, which is still really lacking. And where they do appear, so where we've seen the gender directive in Europe, or the directive against violence against women and girls, and some of the work in the online safety bill in the UK, actually the focus is always on that criminalization and kind of post-harm approaches, rather than investment in prevention and understanding how the systems and features of online platforms are actually contributing to harm. So we do have a long way to go, but some of the principles that have been brought out in your research around how to do this from an intersectional lens is something that we hold very, very core to the way that we do our research as well. If you focus on the people that are most disproportionately impacted by harm and understand their experiences, you can understand those interlocking forms of power that are shaping the harm, and that those solutions that we come up with and those insights that we come up with can support the most vulnerable and the wider kind of groups that are experiencing gender-based violence.
Thank you. And I should believe you agree. We have a question from H. Allen. Maybe you can ask your question directly because
it's rather long.
yeah.
Yes, certainly. Sorry. I work in transport, and I work a lot on sexual harassment in the public space and on public transport. So what I've found is that very often men sexually harass, and it's usually men, unfortunately, either vulnerable men or women, because they think that they can get away with it. They think that there isn't a risk. And yet there's a lot of organizations that are working on, training for diversity, training for gender equality, and addressing no tolerance of violence in the workplace. So my question is really about how to only have a certain amount of money, and yet I think that we are looking at it through too narrow a lens, and that there could be a lot of interest and knowledge building about why people do it, and on the other side, on preventative actions, if and I use men as the kind of group word for the perpetrators. If the perpetrators are really worried that they will get caught, that there are criminal consequences, that this could actually make them lose their job, then I think that it begins to get people to think differently and to realize that this is unacceptable. So I would just be really interested, we have a very experienced community there. I'd be really interested to hear anybody's views on that.
Who feels like answering? I don't remember we have seen results. So who's, Gabriela, you were raising your hand, yes?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond from a kind of digital perspective. What we've seen around the increasing criminalization of certain things, so your example around sexual assault or things like flashing on transport, we've seen translate into the current online safety bill in the UK. There's going to be a new law around cyber flashing. And the way that the focus of the law has been created is that it is intent-based. So if the perpetrator intended to humiliate, distress, or get sexual gratification from that act, then they can be convicted. And if they are convicted, then they can get up to 2 years in prison for that. So quite a severe kind of sentencing for that. But what we're finding is, given all the research that's happened around how online gender-based violence is treated within the criminal justice system, that actually having laws like that are intent-based, which are very difficult to prove, and not consent-based, mean it's very likely that victim survivors are going to go through that system and not get justice. And those perpetrators might well be engaged in that process, but they also aren't going to be put to justice. And then on the other side, when they might be, if we were to make it a consent-based law, but keep the sentencing as quite high, that actually something like non-consensual image sharing at the moment is incredibly normalized, even though it's very harmful. And particularly for younger people, there is not an understanding, even for those who are experiencing that form of harm, that it is abuse. And so there's a lot of work to do around the educational piece to understand the motivations of, say, young men for sharing those images and not understanding that as a form of abuse. We've seen some research come out of Liverpool University around the some of the reasons that people that young men take part in those kind of non-consensual image sharing is actually to bond with their friends. It's kind of a laddish attitude that brings bonding amongst men. So how do we actually tackle that problem? Rather than focus our attentions, which we're all working on small resources. How do we work collectively to focus on changing those attitudes and changing that understanding of what consent is, both offline and online, rather than focusing on changing the law, which often the criminal justice system doesn't bring the justice it promises. And I would say there that it's really important. At Glitch, we focus on Black women's experiences and other marginalised groups. And in the UK, Black women are much less likely to go via a criminal justice route. So even if they do experience that form of harm, even if the law is in place and we feel that it's a law that is empowering for women, that actually certain communities who've experienced harm via criminal justice or feel that they're more at risk of experiencing harm in that system won't get justice in that sense. So we're creating a form of justice that is actually only working for certain women, and we need to be very careful of that.
Thank you, Gabriela.
Could I just ask for a clarification on my question, because it sounds like I might not have posed it in quite the right way. So my question was actually more about the fact that in the private sector, there is a lot of organizational training going on for both men and women on equality, you know, non-violence in the workplace and whatever. And the research gap that I see is, how could we use that to bring it into the domestic area, so that because men were more trained and made aware of the unacceptability of this behavior, would that then make them less likely to be violent at home? That's really my question. So it's that link. It's not actually the legal side of it, which is relatively robust, but it's not used because of the nature of the problem.
Okay, sorry for misunderstanding. Well, I can comment only on the kind of digital aspects. At Glitch, we do work directly with companies. So we will work with companies to do training for their employees on online gender-based violence and engaging all employees in that, and trying to raise awareness of different forms of violence and trying to really raise awareness that we can all be perpetrators in that sense, that it's very easy because a lot of these behaviors are normalized. And alongside that, we work with companies to put in kind of policies of digital prevention and care in that workplace that often is remote or uses a lot of kind of online workspace. So we do that, but I do think that, you know, we need that research. You're right about that gap existing to understand what is the impact of that work, and actually is that something that's missing from the way that we're really investing our time and resources across the sector to prevent harm. So yeah, completely agree.
Thank you. We are in the last couple of minutes of our webinar. So Lorena, you had raised your hand, so you want?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, just briefly. Now that you clarified the question, it makes indeed, I think it's a very, very relevant question. And I was thinking about the monitoring proceeding before the Grevio about the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. And I think it would be very interesting to incorporate this question in a way that Grevio can also include it in the monitoring, because what I see in my research is that states and civil society report very interesting measures being adopted at the domestic level to work on the prevention side, also in the private sector, which I think is interesting to extrapolate to the domestic sphere, as you were suggesting. I think this is a very interesting question. So I wanted to highlight that in terms of the prohibition of the digital violence, I completely agree with you, Gabriela, about the impact of criminalization of some of these forms of violence, and to what extent other responses are more suitable. And this is a discussion we had at length as well. And one of the main issues there was to allow domestic authorities to be able to intervene in a way that otherwise is not possible. But shifting the focus to the Council of Europe, we see that the monitoring of the states before Grevio brings all of these different experiences, which are very interesting from the preventive side, about things that are being incorporated at the national level. So perhaps there is also a place to identify better stories on this area. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are coming at the end of the time slot we had reserved for this webinar. So I want to thank you all for the contributions. I'm sorry that we cannot keep on going the discussion. But before I pass on to Claire to close, I want to give a message. At RESISTIRÉ, we produce this type of research agenda, and we try to push it towards funding organizations for them to be aware. And so I think we should all support Forte and Thomas' endeavor to have a strategic funding program on the subject, because it's clearly on the base of our discussion that the need is there, and there is need for more evidence to make the policies and the services more effective. Thank you all from my side. Claire, your turn.
Thank you, Alain. And thank you everyone for attending, and many thanks to our three speakers for an inspiring discussion. Clearly it would be good to have more time to discuss these issues. Before I close the webinar, I just wanted to share with you a link to the RESISTIRÉ survey. So this is a survey that can be done online or on mobile application, and it helps us measure the impact of COVID-19 policies in Europe. And the aim is to improve the responses to future crises. So we would love if you're able to participate in the survey. It takes approximately 10 minutes, and there will be new modules added next week. We thank you in advance if you're able to participate. It's anonymous and it's translated into several languages, so feel free to share it. So thank you again for joining us today. As I said earlier, the recording will be available on the RESISTIRÉ website, and we will share it with you in the follow-up email in case you would like to share the discussion with other people. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for this really inspiring conversation.